welcome to One Film, One Federation, celebrating a festival of Jean-Pierre Melville and celebrating the film Le Cercle Rouge. Un grand merci to our sponsors, France Today and Bonjour Paris. AFUSA is the largest Alliance Française network in the world, helping 25,000 learners of French each year learn French, live French, and love French with the Alliance Française. Please stay tuned to a few of our national events coming up soon. You can go to afusa.org and take a look at Adrian Leeds, who's coming up, our next Melville discussion on Bob Le Flambeur in December, and many other programs coming up going on afusa.org. During the program, please stay on mute, stay on speaker view. Please put your questions in the chat, and if you have technical issues, sign back in after a few minutes using the original Zoom link. This event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and the total runtime should be 1 hour. I'd love to introduce Laurent Grousset, president of the Jean-Pierre Melville Foundation, a prominent director and producer of over 1,100 commercials in Europe, America, and Asia. Laurent Grousset received many awards for his work at international festivals such as New York, Paris, Cannes, Venice, and London. Laurent directed episodes of well-known TV series like Les Chevaliers du Ciel, The Aeronauts, as well as various short films. He is the owner and CEO of several production companies in France, Bulgaria, and Spain. He is an acknowledged expert on advertising production practice and cost management throughout Europe and the Middle East. Laurent Grousset is also a writer. We are also honored to welcome Rémi Grumbach, Vice President of the Jean-Pierre Melville Foundation. Rémi Grumbach is a famous French director and producer known for Les Rendez-vous du Dimanche, a weekly TV show he directed for 10 years, and that was presented by star host Michael Drucker. Rémi also directed Avis de Recherche and Le Jeu de la Vérité, presented by Patrick Sabatier. Rémi directed many special award TV shows, such as the prestigious Victoire de la Musique, Molière, Cannes Film Festival, Midem, or Sept d'Or Cérémonie. In 1980, Rémi Grumbach became a SACEM member of the SACEM Directors Commission since 1984. He was president of the organization from 2000 to 2003. Since then, he has been one of the company's administrators. Among the many awards he received during his career, Rémi Grumbach was recipient of the Audiovisual Author Director Grand Prix in 2006. Equally as thrilled to reintroduce Peter de Bruges, chief film critic from Variety magazine. Peter is the chief film critic for Variety, where he has worked since 2005, including a 2-year stint in Paris, where he focused on covering the international festival circuit. Peter is the recipient of the 2018 Prix Alliance Française de Los Angeles and has been awarded the rank of Chevalier in the Ordre des Arts et des Lettres and is an honorary member of the Jean-Pierre Melville Foundation. Welcome, everyone, to discuss Le Cercle Rouge.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you both again. To remind anyone, we have the other guests here, right? I'm not seeing everybody on my screen. Okay, it's all there. To remind everybody, it's our two guests here are both nephews also of Jean-Pierre Melville. They grew up around him and both were able to sort of work with him briefly in the pre-production of one of his films. For those of you who've seen Le Cercle Rouge, this film is really a summation, I think, of everything about Melville's interests and his obsessions. He was very interested in American cinema and very inspired by certain directors, but especially by John Huston, by the film The Asphalt Jungle. And he'd been wanting to make his entire career a heist film. He had been the person who'd been kind of attached to direct Rififi before that movie ended up sort of shifting in its composition and was made by Jules Dessin instead. But maybe we can start maybe with that story, if either of you guys know kind of what Melville's connection was to Rififi earlier in his career. Either of you, Laurent or Rémi, Do you know that story?
Not really.
Okay. No.
Okay. Then I become the authority on this particular detail. It's something he shared with the Portuguese critic based in France and who was sort of a contributor to Sight and Sound. He did a book-long interview with Jean-Pierre Melville for the Cinema One series, in which he discussed specifically the idea that early on that movie Rafifi was something that he'd planned to direct. And so in a way, many years later, he was able to do a heist film. And I think the thing that Rafifi is most famous for, which is having the heist take place almost entirely without dialogue, is something we see Melville do here, which leads me to speculate, but I hoped maybe one of you could tell us whether that was his idea that he suggested for Rafifi and that Rafifi maybe, sort of adopted. But let's focus on what we do know about this film. What can you tell us about the sort of origins of the project Le Cercle Rouge, which followed after his first collaboration with Alain Delon on Le Samouraï, and of course, The Army of Shadows, the film that we watched last month?
Yeah, there is one thing to start with, which is, I think, important. Jean-Pierre hated shooting. He was always saying that the film was made on script writing and editing. And the shoot he went through with the Cercle Rouge was the worst he ever had. Because all the technicians he knew well got a little embourgeoisé. Nobody worked well. He was supposed to shoot during 50 days, and they shot 66 days. And Jean-Pierre was always saying that was his worst experience of shooting, which, thank God, don't show in the film.
Yeah, it's true. He covers it well. But it is something that he also shared in that interview with Noguera, where he talks about, he almost sort of dismisses everyone he worked with except for the set decorator and the props person, but Remy, what do you sort of remember about Jean-Pierre's involvement with this film? Did you have any observation of it at the time?
Oui, ce que vient de dire Laurent est important parce que Jean-Pierre n'aimait pas les tournages, à vrai dire. Ce qu'il aimait, c'était la préparation d'un film, l'écriture d'un film, et ensuite le montage. Il passait des heures entières au montage, il était tout le temps au montage avec son monteur. À la limite, il n'était pas l'assistant monteur, mais le monteur devenait l'assistant de Jean-Pierre monteur, et non pas menteur. Et il était... le Cercle Rouge, c'était quelque chose de très particulier pour lui parce que c'était une sorte de concrétisation du travail qu'il avait fait avec Delon. Delon a beaucoup participé au Cercle Rouge. Il n'a pas donné ses idées, mais il a beaucoup discuté avec Jean-Pierre. Ils en ont beaucoup parlé. Ça a été vraiment un film qui a été la collaboration de deux très forts personnages. D'une part, un metteur en scène qui n'admettait pas qu'on discute son travail. D'autre part, un acteur qui était sûr de son travail. Et ces deux hommes qui étaient très sûrs d'eux-mêmes, quand ils étaient ensemble, faisaient un bloc total dans le métier. C'est-à-dire qu'ils n'avaient, pour finir, ils s'entendaient parfaitement. Jean-Pierre ne s'était pas entendu du tout avec Lino Ventura. Jean-Pierre ne s'était pas entendu avec beaucoup de ses acteurs. Mais avec Delon, c'était une sorte de filiation. C'est-à-dire que Delon était probablement le fils que Jean-Pierre aurait voulu avoir. Et leur travail était celui d'un père et d'un fils, à vrai dire. Je pense que le fils de Jean-Pierre, c'est Delon. Conclusion.
I think what Laurence said is really very important. Jean-Pierre really hated shooting films. What he really loved was the preparation, the writing, the editing. Particularly in the editing, he would go into the editing room and he would be there for 2 hours straight with the assistant editor. And he really immersed himself in the editing process. And I think that in this particular film, it really represents a concretization of Alain Delon's work. Alain Delon had worked with him in prior film. And in this film, he discussed a lot with Jean-Pierre, and they really collaborated, but it was an interesting collaboration because these were two very strong personalities. Jean-Pierre generally did not like to have any discussion of his work. And Alain Delon wanted to discuss what was happening, but they had an absolutely excellent kind of collaboration. And it's important because Jean-Pierre did not get along with a lot of the other actors that he worked with, not with Lino Ventura, not with a lot of the others. But with Delon, it was almost as if there was a meshing of the two personalities, and that Delon was, in a way, the son that Jean-Pierre would have liked to have had.
It's funny because Delon is such a handsome actor that he basically obliged him to wear a mustache. I don't know whether he grew it out or more likely he pasted it on, but this was just, in Melville's estimation, a way that he could kind of remove the distraction of Delon's beauty in this film. We can look back to the earlier collaboration on Le Samouraï, but do either of you kind of recall the beginning of that partnership? This, as you said, is sort of them building on a shorthand and sharing ideas. But do you remember how Melville came to work with Delon in the first place?
I don't. Do you, Remy?
Remy, you were telling some stories last time about Delon.
Je crois que, enfin, je pense que Delon, enfin, a pris comme un cadeau de la part de Jean-Pierre de faire Le Samouraï, car c'est dans ce film qu'il a été le plus, qui s'est retrouvé totalement un acteur formidable. Et le rapport, moi, je les ai vus souvent ensemble, à Tilly, dans la maison de Jean-Pierre, parce que j'habitais pas très loin, et il y avait, et je connaissais très bien Alain, pour la bonne raison que j'avais travaillé avec lui, qui était venu dans mes émissions. Alain, qui est quelqu'un d'intouchable, pour ainsi dire, qui n'admettait pas la contradiction, qui était l'acteur principal et une énorme, pas une vedette, mais une star. Avec Jean-Pierre, il se comportait comme un enfant. C'était très bizarre. Il écoutait ce que disait Jean-Pierre, il acquiesçait et il écoutait toutes ses recommandations et tous ses conseils. Le travail de Delon avec Jean-Pierre était complètement différent, je pense, qu'avec les autres metteurs en scène. Il avait beaucoup tourné avec Verneuil, et Verneuil disait à Jean-Pierre, je me souviens parce qu'un jour, j'ai été à pas une réunion, mais un rendez-vous qu'avaient Jean-Pierre et Verneuil disait, tu as fait de Delon quelqu'un que je n'avais pas envisagé, que je n'avais pas compris, que tu allais plus loin que moi dans la manière de travailler avec Delon, dans ce qu'on peut ressortir de Delon.
I think that working with Alain Delon on Samouraï, it was almost a gift for Jean-Pierre that he had this really formidable actor who was working with him in this part. And they were always together. I would always see them together. And I knew Alain Delon very well. He had appeared on several of my programs. And he was really the main actor, but he wasn't just the star. He was the center. He was the centerpiece of the film. And with Jean-Pierre, in a way, the roles were reversed. And Jean-Pierre was almost like the child in this situation because he would listen to Delon's recommendations or his suggestions. And I remember that Jean-Pierre had a meeting with Verneuil, and Verneuil said to him, it's incredible because this relationship that you've developed with Delon is something that I would have never envisaged, and I would have never imagined that it could have happened, but it did.
I'm going to summarize something from this book about Delon, just because our listeners may appreciate this, but it's apparently Melville had reached out to Delon to offer him a role. He was going to make an adaptation of the book Main Pleine, and Delon politely turned it down. And then after Le Deuxième Souffle was a big success, he reached out proactively to Melville about working together. And Melville, because he seems to have kind of a droll and slightly wicked sense of humor, suggested that they make the film that he had previously turned down. But by this point, it had already been made by someone else, so it was just a kind of provocation. He offered Delon the role of Gerbier in L'Armée des Ombres, but Delon passed on this. And then Delon said, "Do you have anything else? Surely you must have a script tucked away." And sure enough, Melville had written Le Samouraï expressly for Delon. And Delon insisted that Melville come over, read him the script. And the story that's recounted here says that after about 7.5 minutes, Delon said, "You've been reading this script to me, and there hasn't been a word of dialogue in it yet. Sign me up." And from then on, they were working together. But I like this notion because it's clear that this was a specific kind of challenge that Delon was interested in. And it continues. If we look at Le Cercle Rouge as kind of a summation of things that Melville had been working on, this is also a movie that starts for almost 7 minutes without there being any dialogue. There are long sequences, including the heist, that were done without speech. Do either of you have any sort of recollection of, it seems to be almost a challenge that Melville was setting for himself in trying to tell, what Hitchcock described as pure cinema, of telling a story with the image and sound, but without dialogue?
Yeah, but Jean-Pierre saw the asphalt jungle, as you said, and he was saying that there was only 19 situations which could happen between a thief and a policeman. 19, not 20, not 18. And it was very strange because he applied that completely. And he had many things like that in the film, which found strange, like everybody calls the other by his surname. Nobody uses his first name.
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying that the only women used to use the first name, but never the men. And in the film, they do it, of course. It's
interesting. He seems to have been sort of a mastermind for analyzing films, other people's films, deconstructing how they're made, being able to, the mechanics of them, and then rebuilding that on set. But then again, as you said, it could be very frustrating to try and translate the idea he had in his head to a crew and to make sure that they delivered that. What about working with Henri Deca, the cinematographer on the film? They'd been working together a number of times, and here they seem to be working in color, but with an almost black and white aesthetic.
Yeah, but Henri Deca and Jean-Pierre Melville had a very strong relationship since the beginning, since his first film. But the way Deca acted during the Cercle Rouge was absolutely wrong for Jean-Pierre. And that's why he stopped working with him after that. There was a big separation between the two. But he said that Deca during the film was very slow, took his ease, and was not the Deca used to know.
Mm. Yeah, this is sort of borne out by other things I've read too, the idea that Melville was still much younger than a lot of his crew members, and it seems like this was one of the frustrations. If you said that the film went far over budget, I'm not entirely sure kind of which anecdotes you might know about the film, but I want you to share what you know. Would it be more helpful to talk about elements like the famous heist sequence where it's done without sound, or were either of you able to ever discuss Le Cercle Rouge with Jean-Pierre?
Je pense que enfin, on ne pouvait pas discuter de la manière de tourner avec Jean-Pierre. Ces deux hommes avaient une confiance absolue l'un en l'autre, mais ils savaient quelle était leur part de travail. Je ne pense pas que Jean-Pierre, certainement, il expliquait évidemment la scène qu'il voulait obtenir avec Delon, mais je ne pense pas qu'il lui demandait son avis. Je crois que Jean-Pierre a toujours été très intransigeant est très fortement incliné à penser que le maître d'œuvre d'un film, c'était intégralement le metteur en scène, et que l'acteur était était façonné par le metteur en scène. Et je pense, j'en avais discuté avec Alain, et Alain me disait, j'ai jamais trouvé aucune objection à être manipulé. Je vous dis ce mot parce que c'est lui qui l'avait employé, à être manipulé par Jean-Pierre. Parce que Jean-Pierre croyait qu'avec moi, il fallait certains détours de pensée, certaines explications, mais je savais très bien qu'il me manipulait entièrement et que j'étais un objet entre ses mains.
I think that, excuse me, with Jean-Pierre, it wasn't really possible to discuss how he was shooting a film because he was someone who had such complete confidence in his own work and what he was doing that he really wouldn't tolerate that kind of discussion. He knew what he wanted to do. And I know that with Delon, he would explain a scene, but he wasn't asking for Delon's opinion on how to shoot the scene. And he was, as a director, he was very intransigent. Many times he would be very, very, very demanding. And part of it had to do with the fact that his vision of the director was indeed the master of what was being done, what was being shot. And he didn't want input from others. And I know that I had an opportunity to discuss this with Alain Delon, and Alain told me that he never really had an objection to the way Jean-Pierre treated him because he knew that Jean-Pierre was manipulating him. And I use that word specifically because that was the word that Delon used when he was describing this. And he knew he was being manipulated, and he knew that Jean-Pierre was trying to get him to think a certain way or to explain things in a certain way, but it never really bothered him that Jean-Pierre was doing that with him.
Sorry, I muted myself. One of the things I appreciate in this film is just the kind of procedural aspect, his attention to the steps involved in things. And, his timing is, it's very old fashioned. It's not, the way that we're used to seeing movies play out now, but it makes you realize just the amount of patience and effort that goes into this work. And you realize in a way that a robbery is a kind of work as well, even if it's, illegal and illicit. But do you know, in terms of how he would construct a scene like that? And I mean, I guess at the screenwriting stage, is this something where he's using imagination, or if I had to guess, he's basing it much more on research, either on how another heist might have gone, or, he might be interrogating people who are professionals to ask them. He seemed to have friends who were kind of on both sides of the law.
No, there was a big mixture on that. First, Jean-Pierre had a huge knowledge of thousands of films he had seen, and he was taking ideas from them. But then, as well, he knew very well the milieu. I don't know what the milieu is in English.
The world.
Right.
Yeah.
The world.
The bad people.
Yeah.
And that helped him construct this completely. It's a mixture of his knowledge of what he saw and what he learned with those people. Totally.
And it also plays into, we've been talking about this in these previous weeks, but it plays into this kind of ambiguity between the good guys and the bad guys. You have police doing their job, and you have these three different types of criminals, one of whom is a former policeman, which is an interesting statement,
Pour Peter, pour en revenir à ce que disait Laurent tout à l'heure, oui. Jean-Pierre connaissait très très bien le milieu parce qu'il était fasciné par le milieu. La preuve, c'est que l'un de ses premiers films, son premier polar véritable, qui est Bob le Flambeur, il est non seulement allé chercher un acteur qui avait fait partir du milieu, qui était Roger Duchesne, mais qui en plus avait été collabo. ce qui était l'inverse de ce qu'avait été Jean-Pierre, qui avait été un héros véritable de guerre et un héros de la résistance. Il était non seulement allé chercher Roger Duchesne, mais il est allé le chercher à la sortie de sa prison. C'est-à-dire, en voiture, il a attendu la porte. La porte, il y a des images d'archives d'ailleurs, je crois de ça. La porte s'ouvre, Roger Duchesne sort, il se retrouve dans la rue, il y a la voiture qui était déjà une immense voiture, une américaine qu'avait Jean-Pierre à l'époque, et il ouvre la portière, il se penche, il ouvre la portière, et l'autre monte dans sa portière, et ils partent ensemble. Et ce Roger Duchesne, pourquoi il avait pris Roger Duchesne? Parce qu'il ne voulait pas travailler avec Gabin. Il savait qu'avec Gabin, il ne pourrait pas travailler. Et je pense que Laurent connaît très bien cette histoire. Donc, il ne voulait pas se confronter à Gabin, il ne voulait pas discuter avec Gabin. Il pensait que Gabin n'était non pas supérieur en renommée, mais aurait assez d'influence pour l'emmerder et il ne pourrait pas faire son film tel qu'il l'envisageait vraiment. Or, quand il est allé chercher Roger Duchesne, il voulait en faire le rival de Gabin. Ça n'a pas marché parce que Roger Duchesne ne faisait pas le poids, n'avait pas cette aura qu'avait Gabin. Mais peut-être que s'il avait eu Gabin et non pas Roger Duchesne, ça aurait été encore plus formidable.
I think that Jean-Pierre knew this milieu very well. And to go back to one of his earliest films, Bob Le Flambeur, the actor who plays the role of Bob, Roger Duchesne, he specifically sought him out, and it's someone who is the complete opposite of Jean-Pierre himself. He was not only a criminal, but he had also been a collaborator during the war, and Jean-Pierre had been a war hero in the resistance. So this was somebody who was completely the contrary of what Jean-Pierre himself was. And he actually went to the prison to wait for Duchesne to exit the prison on the day that he was being released. And I believe there are even photos of this in the archives. And Jean-Pierre was already in his big American car waiting for Duchesne to come out. And Duchesne came out and walked down the street, and Jean-Pierre pulled up and opened the door, and Duchesne got in. And the reason he wanted to work with Duchesne was he did not want to work with Gabin. He did not, and I think that Laurent knows the story about this, but he felt that if he had worked with Gabin, he would not be able to make the kind of film that he envisaged it being, that perhaps Gabin was too strong a personality, or in a sense took himself to be superior. And so what he really wanted to do was to set up Roger Duchesne as a rival to Gabin in the cinema, but it didn't work out because either Duchesne doesn't have the kind of weight or the kind of aura that Gabin had, or it just didn't work. But it's interesting to speculate how good the film is and how much greater it might have been had Gabin been the actor who was used.
We'll be watching Bob Le Flambeur for next month's session, and we'll talk some more about that. I think we'll also use that opportunity to talk about the early stage of Melville's career. This is really the late stage, of Melville working. He died quite young, but he only made one more film after this. And in some ways, I think there are some interesting things in En Flic, which he makes with Catherine Deneuve and Alain Delon. But, this for me really is his last masterpiece. And we really see just these entire plan séquence, these stretches of the film that feel like just kind of like perfect vehicles unto themselves. But this was also at a moment that was really quite devastating to Melville. The film proved to be an enormous success commercially, but he was coming off of this personal setback where he had created really the only studio of its kind in the world, a studio operated by a filmmaker and that had allowed him his independence, and it had basically gone up in flames with most of his effects. Was it 1 or 2 years before this? You guys must know kind of just what that period was like for Jean-Pierre. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
When you mean the fire?
That's right, and just sort of the effect that that had on his morale and his momentum.
I remember the day after going with him to the studio, exactly what was left of the studio, and he was devastated but very strong. He knew exactly that this would happen again, and he did it. You know, but that fire was terrible, really terrible. As Remy told us last time, during the fire, Jean-Pierre went in the studio to save his cats. You remember, Remy?
Oui, non seulement je me souviens, mais ce qui est extraordinaire, Laurent, et Peter, ce qui est extraordinaire, c'est que Jean-Pierre a été sauvé par son chat. Parce que Jean-Pierre dormait dans l'obscurité totale et le silence total, avec des trucs sur les oreilles et un bandeau sur les yeux. Et Jean-Pierre n'avait pas senti la fumée. C'est son chat qui l'a réveillé. Donc Jean-Pierre s'est enfui, carrément, est parti, et arrivé dans la rue, il a vu son studio brûler, en attendant des pompiers qui n'arrivaient pas, et puis tout d'un coup, il s'est souvenu qu'il y avait le chat. Il est rentré, malgré des pompiers qui sont arrivés et qui voulaient l'empêcher de le faire, et qui ne voulaient pas rentrer parce qu'ils pensaient que ça allait s'embraser, qu'il allait avoir des souffles d'air, ça allait être très dangereux. Il est retourné, il est monté dans les escaliers, il a traversé, il habitait au premier étage de son studio. Il a monté l'escalier qui était en flammes, il a pris son chat, il est ressorti avec son chat. Mais ce qui est extraordinaire, c'est qu'à vrai dire, je pense, et Laurent en conviendra totalement, j'en suis sûr, que Jean-Pierre, qui était un vrai héros de guerre, qui avait combattu, qui avait fait la guerre, était quelqu'un qui n'avait pas peur de la mort. Alors qu'il savait qu'il était condamné par la maladie. Il était vraiment terriblement cardiaque. Il pouvait avoir un infarctus à n'importe quel moment. Il le savait de temps en temps. Laurent et moi, on l'a vu en travaillant avec lui, très peu, parce qu'on a très peu travaillé avec lui, mais on l'a vu tout d'un coup se crisper sur sa chaise, se lever, s'asseoir par terre, se mettre le dos contre le mur et attendre que ça passe. Et c'était très singulier. Tu te souviens, Laurent?
Absolutely, but he wasn't scared at all, you know.
C'était très, très, très particulier parce que c'est un homme qui avait toujours vécu très proche de la mort et pour lui, c'était familier la mort. Il n'en avait pas peur. Et c'est très rare. Les gens ont plus ou moins peur de la mort, plutôt plus que moi même. Et lui avait côtoyé tellement la mort dans sa jeunesse de 19 ans jusqu'à l'âge de 26 ans pendant la guerre, et ensuite à cause de sa maladie, c'est qu'il prenait toutes les années comme des années en plus, je pense. Mais il savait qu'il pouvait mourir à n'importe quel moment. Et il est mort d'ailleurs à n'importe quel moment. À un moment donné, il n'aurait pas dû mourir. Et il a eu sa crise, qui était le 3e infarctus qu'il faisait. Il nous avait toujours dit, à Laurent et à moi, on fait au maximum 3 infarctus, le 3e est mortel. Pour lui, ça a été une vérité absolue. Il est mort à son 3e infarctus. Et ce qu'on a comme souvenir, Laurent et moi, de Jean-Pierre, c'est qu'on a admiré, je sais que Laurent aussi, on a admiré un homme, d'une part, qui est un héros, qui nous paraissait être un héros, qu'on savait être un héros, et qu'on a admiré comme un metteur en scène aussi, un des meilleurs metteurs en scène du monde. Et donc, ça a été pour nous un héros total, Jean-Pierre, à vrai dire. Alors qu'on ne l'intéressait pas tellement. Il était gentil avec nous, il passait un peu de temps avec nous, mais je sais qu'on ne l'intéressait pas.
I think that this story is really an extraordinary one because Jean-Pierre was, in effect, actually saved by his cat. He was somebody who, when he slept, he had to sleep in complete darkness. So he had earplugs, he had a eye mask, and was totally in the dark. And it was the cat who awakened him. when it was already on fire. And so he was able to escape, and he managed to make it out onto the street. And when he was out on the street, he realized that the cat wasn't with him. So while the fire department arrived, they wanted to prevent him from going back in, but he was insistent that he was going back in to save his cat. So he actually went inside the burning building, and he went in and he climbed up the stairs, and there were already flames, and there was already a lot of smoke. And he climbed up and he found his cat, and he brought his cat out to safety. And it was really thanks to the cat having awakened him that he was able to himself perhaps survive this particular, the event of the fire. And I think that, and I think here Laurent will agree with me 100%, that Jean-Pierre was really someone who was a hero, and he wasn't afraid of death. This was something that was part of his life, even from a very early age, from the age of 19 on, in his experience during the war, the First World War, and then in the resistance. And he was actually his condemnation was his health. It was the fact that he had this terrible heart condition, and he could have a heart attack at any time and die from it. And I think that Laurent and I had actually seen this happen, where he was in his office and was sitting, and all of a sudden would just sort of collapse and then get up and go stand up against the wall and press himself against the wall, waiting for the whole attack to pass. And he had a sense of, having always lived close to death, that he wasn't really afraid of death. But it's sometimes said that when you have a heart condition and you have had heart attacks, that you may survive the first two, but it's usually the third heart attack that will kill you. And in this case, it was what happened with Jean-Pierre. It was the third heart attack that he had that was responsible for killing him. And I think our memory, Laurent and mine, is of a man who we admired incredibly as a man, as a hero, but we also admired him incredibly as a director, the greatest director in the world. And so for us, he was the total package, the total hero, both as a hero, as a man, and also as a film director.
I have a casting question, and that's it's sort of two in one. One is, as we speak of the cat, I think it's such an interesting detail that the police inspector has these two cats at home, and that Melville shows this, because it's not something that seems macho or masculine, but it adds a dimension to the character. I'm wondering if one of those cats might have been Melville's Siamese, but at the same time, it was
both of the cats were Melville.
They were both his cat. I think
Yeah.
you'd said in the story that he goes in for two cats, right? Like,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
those were the two. And then Bourvil is a very interesting casting choice, because he's an actor that is more commonly associated with comedies, I think, in French cinema.
But it was hard. No, first of all, the original casting was completely different.
Right.
And the Bourvil was going to be Ventura. But Ventura didn't want to shoot with Jean-Pierre because of his relation after l'Armée des Ombres. Yves Montand was going to be Paul Meurice.
Mm-hmm.
And what's his name? Jean-Marie Volonté was going to be
Right.
Belmondo. That was the original casting, but he didn't want to take Belmondo because Alain and him had just done Borsalino together, and that's why he didn't want to do it. But first of all, Bourvil didn't want to do it, because he said, I'm not a policeman, I'm an humble man, very humble man, I know nothing of that. It was very hard for Jean-Pierre to convince him. First of all, he said, you're going to look beautiful. He took him to big tailor, had a three-piece suit made for him, arranged a little wig to show his calvitie here, and changing completely. Because Bourvil was really a peasant originally and looked like a peasant. And this, it changed completely, totally.
Yeah, he's dignified in the film. Go
Et il ne
ahead.
faut pas oublier, Peter, il ne faut pas oublier que Jean-Pierre n'a pas tourné avec Bourvil. Il a tourné avec André. Bourvil.
Yeah.
Il y tenait beaucoup. Il ne tournait pas. Il a complètement dès le départ, transfigurer Bourvil en lui redonnant son prénom. Et dans le film, il y tenait énormément. C'était André Bourvil, l'acteur, pas Bourvil.
D'accord. Okay.
I think it's important that he had never shot with Bourvil, and he really, doing this film, he really transformed him into something else. He transformed him into the actor that was André Bourvil, not even just using the single name Bourvil as he had always been known.
That's great. The what do
You
you
know, it was very
Go ahead.
strange because in order to convince Bourvil, he showed him in cold blood Brooks. And there was there a policeman who was called by Richard Forsyth, if I remember, and said,
Mhm.
"This is the kind of policeman I want you to be." And that helps very much.
There was a question from one of our listeners, from Conrad. Ellen, the question was in French, so if you don't mind translating it into English for any who might need that, including myself, I wouldn't be the strongest at translating this, but it's relevant to something we were talking about earlier, and I'll let you read Conrad's words.
Okay, it says, I was completely charmed by Melville. I found the three thieves nicer than, or better, or more sympathetic than Commissaire Matte. During the heist, I wanted them to succeed. I was afraid that the guard would succeed in setting off the alarm by pressing the button with his forehead. Nevertheless, soon I recognized that they were all headed towards death. And from this point of view, their initial meetings, apparently by accident, really were inexorable.
In a way, the question behind, which I think is very interesting, is about the idea that an audience might feel greater sympathy for the criminals in this movie. And I think that that's quite deliberate, and it is an extension of something we saw in L'Armée des Ombres, in Army of Shadows last month. You know, it seems to be that Melville himself was very skeptical of the law and some of the tactics that they used, and we see that play out here with what happens to the son of the I forget the character's name, but the the club owner, and Sarti, I think, is the character's name, and where he's kind of tricked into a false arrest, and it ends up leading to the son's suicide. But the sympathy for these men, who are introduced, there's a question of saying, like, you're not a terrorist, but even the wording "you're not a terrorist" suggests that somebody thinks he's a terrorist, and that there's a distinction being made in judgment. But would you two talk about kind of because I think it's very key to Melville, this kind of philosophy about how to have empathy, I guess, or understanding for the lawbreakers in the world.
Well, we said before that Jean-Pierre loved the lawbreakers, but he always said that he hated the real gangsters. All the gangsters are his gangsters. He made them. He didn't like at all the real ones, although he knew them very well. He talked with them, but he didn't respect them.
Okay.
For him, the gangster in his film were his own gangsters, always. The bad guy was Melville. In Melville, I mean.
Tell me what you mean by that. The bad guy was Melville.
Sorry?
What did you mean by that?
No, he felt very near the bad guys.
I see.
Sorry, his bad guys.
Right.
It was his creation.
Well, and even if you think of someone whose, heroism was during the war and involved, the resistance movement, all of this is kind of, the law is wrong at that time, and, resistance and breaking the law is the right thing to do. And I think what is so interesting about his work, but this film above all, and this ending, this tragic ending, not everyone has to die, but in a way, these men are making sacrifices for one another, hoping that at least their colleagues or their comrades will survive. And it's this that distinguishes, I think, the Matte character, who does the underhanded trick to kind of that backfires. The tragedy of that is distinguished from the kind of noble way that the men are sacrificing themselves for one another and all die in this last scene. This is my interpretation, these codes between men, and we see this in film after film. It's true of Le Samurai, of Le Doulos. It really seems to be the thing that I return to in Melville's work, because it's about a kind of different law or a different morality from the one that maybe society at large would agree on. But he seems to have a crystal clear understanding in his head, Melville's head, of how men should behave, and judges them.
Yes, he had that very, very clear. And this code came directly from the war. Sure,
that makes sense.
Completely. I remember Jean-Pierre telling me one day that he had a lovely conversation with a German officer, and there was no hate, nothing. There were two warriors talking together.
Mm-hmm. Like so in the War film, in a way.
Yeah, he respected that. And he said he could have been a friend with me, very, very easily. And that's a strange reaction.
Remy, I was saying that long analysis in English, but do you have anything to add to this idea of un code d'honneur entre les hommes dans le film de Melville?
Pardon, j'ai pas compris, un code d'honneur?
Entre les hommes, je crois que dans les films de Melville, dans un sens, la gravité, le soul, ça revient toujours sur ces codes. C'est pas le loi, c'est plus un sens de
oui, tout à fait.
Correct, le droit.
C'est une forme, comment pourrait-on dire, c'est une forme de règle de vie, ce qu'on appelle le code d'honneur d'ailleurs, une règle de vie loyale, c'est-à-dire que moi j'ai toujours été très étonné par un fait, c'est que quand mon père a été tué, a été assassiné pendant la guerre, a été assassiné par un passeur qui a dit il passait avec un groupe d'amis, et puis il était cardiaque, il s'est arrêté. Le passeur a dit qu'il allait le rechercher après avoir passé le sommet dans la montagne des Pyrénées. Il est retourné le chercher, il est revenu, il a dit « je ne l'ai pas trouvé », il a dû redescendre. Le passeur s'appelait Cabrera. Et il m'a appelé avant de mourir. C'est très bizarre comme histoire. Il m'a appelé avant de mourir en me disant de lui pardonner. Je ne savais pas ce que j'avais à lui pardonner. Et il m'a dit qu'il avait tué mon père. Que mon père était à tel endroit dans les Pyrénées. Il l'avait tué à tel endroit, à mi-pente, qu'il se souvenait très bien de l'endroit où il l'avait tué, mais qui voulait m'en parler et qui voulait que je lui pardonne. Or, c'est extraordinaire parce que j'en ai parlé avec Jean-Pierre. Bon, j'ai dit au pasteur évidemment que je ne lui pardonnerai jamais, mais j'en ai parlé avec Jean-Pierre et Jean-Pierre m'a dit il n'a fait que son travail. Je me souviendrai toujours de ça, mais exactement de cette manière-là. Il n'a fait que son travail. Mais j'ai dit, mais je ne sais pas, tu ressens rien. Il m'a dit, je n'ai pas à ressentir. Il devait le faire, il fallait qu'il le fasse. Il ne pouvait pas laisser quelqu'un de vivant qui pouvait renseigner après les Allemands sur le passage des Pyrénées, sur le passage qu'ils prenaient. Et j'ai toujours été étonné parce que Jean-Pierre n'a jamais eu d'animosité dans ses propos. C'était très proche de la guerre quand j'étais jeune. Il n'a jamais eu d'animosité vis-à-vis des Allemands. C'était des adversaires, mais ce n'étaient pas des assassins, ce n'étaient pas des tueurs, ce n'étaient pas des salopards, c'était des adversaires. Et ça m'a toujours étonné, toujours.
I think that regarding this whole idea of the rules by which you live and the code of honor that you have, that my father was killed in the war, and he was killed by a passeur, one of those people who helped people cross the Pyrenees into Spain. And the pastor who was responsible for killing my father, his name was Cabrera, and they were doing the crossing, and my father wasn't able to keep up with them and follow. And he said, "Okay, I'll come back for you." And when he came back for him, he killed him. And he killed him because he knew that he wasn't able to make the crossing, and he couldn't leave him alive because he couldn't risk having him talk to the Germans and tell him what was the path that they were taking. And so sometime after, I received a phone call from Cabrera, and he explained who he was, and he said, I'm the one who killed your father, and I'm killing to ask your pardon. And I realized that I felt I couldn't, and I went to talk to Jean-Pierre about it, and I said, this is the man who killed my father, I can't pardon him. And Jean-Pierre had a very different attitude from mine. He said, well, he was just doing his job. This is what he was there to do, and he was just doing what he had to do. And he had this idea that it was, he had to, take care of the passage in the Pyrenees. And if someone was going to reveal it to the Germans, then that person had to be killed. And that was what his job was. And I realized then that Jean-Pierre, ultimately, he had no animosity towards the Germans, because he viewed them as adversaries. He didn't view them as, dirty, rotten bastards or anything like that. He viewed them as adversaries. And that was his whole approach, both towards the Germans in general, and then in this specific instance with the person who had killed my father.
It's an incredible story, and it's kind of illuminating, I think, both to Army of Shadows, of course, which has these impossible choices that often come down to duty and practicality, but even here, the decisions we see made in this film, I think the way that Alain Delon prepares his car for the escaped convict to ride in it, and the way he kind of this dance that could lead into death at any moment if you flinch or whatever, it all seems to play on a different code from the one that most movies, I feel like we often identify what would I do in this situation, and I feel like in Melville's situation, movies we're watching very specific people from a totally different kind of background or makeup make these choices. One of our viewers, Byron, asks kind of a follow-up question about Bourvil. I don't know the answer to this myself, but he asked, can we assume that Jean-Pierre was a fan of Bourville's films? It's kind of amusing to think of him also liking Louis de Funès slapstick comedies, as well as the kind of movies we associate with his style. Do you happen to know, just speaking a little bit both about his appreciation for Bourvil, but also maybe for those types of movies?
Jean-Pierre was not especially a fan of Bourvil. He liked the man, he saw some of his films, but I wouldn't say that he was a fan of him, absolutely.
Did he have any interest in that kind of, did he watch comedies and things like that? I've never seen him mention them in any of his interviews, but maybe he also liked...
No, he was not a real comedy man at all. Actually, I don't remember talking to him about comedies, strangely enough.
Jean-Pierre riait tout le temps. Hein.
It sounds like he was very funny and full of life. Go ahead.
Un homme qui aimait la vie, qui aimait rire. Il riait tout le temps. Jean-Pierre avait un rire extraordinaire. Il était heureux de vivre. Il communiquait sa joie de vivre. Il était tout le temps en train de... Il avait un rire formidable d'ailleurs. Laurent s'en souvient très bien. Il était... c'était un homme qui était très gai, très heureux de vivre. Et c'est extraordinaire parce que il vivait aussi avec... Jean-Pierre m'avait dit, il l'a dit à Laurent automatiquement, il m'avait dit, les hommes, les Grimbach, puisqu'il s'appelait Jean-Pierre Grimbach évidemment, les Grimbach, les hommes n'ont jamais dépassé 55 ans. Mon père est mort, disait-il, à 54 ans, ton père est mort, il avait 49 ans, ou 40 même plus jeune, aucun Grimbach n'a dépassé 55 ans. Et c'est extraordinaire je pensais à ça l'autre jour et de voir Laurent, j'y pense encore beaucoup plus, c'est que nous, on est deux vieux, quoi. On a
You've broken the
85 ans,
curse.
on a 85 ans tous les deux. On n'est pas morts comme les autres Grimbach, comme tous les hommes Grimbach sont morts avant nous.
On a quand même eu un infarctus, comme tous les Grimbach.
On a quoi?
On a eu un infarctus aussi.
Oui, on a eu aussi un infarctus.
La
On est
lignée de
malade
la
du cœur, sauf que nous, on a profité de la science moderne. On a des stents, c'est fou, quoi. Les Grimbach, on est les deux seuls Grimbach à être restés vivants après 55 ans. Quand on remonte de génération en génération chez les Grimbach, tous les hommes sont morts avant 55 ans.
Et on a l'intention de continuer.
Longtemps, encore, très longtemps. Mais c'est fou, quoi. Et Jean-Pierre se savait condamné automatiquement. Il vivait avec ça. Il vivait avec ça, mais il n'avait pas peur de la mort pour toutes les raisons dont on a parlé, à cause de la guerre qu'il avait faite, à cause il avait côtoyé de si près qu'il n'en avait plus peur. Mais c'était... moi, quand je pense à Jean-Pierre, quand je pense à Jean-Pierre, je pense à son rire. Il avait un rire qu'on pourrait appeler
Communicatif.
C'est un éclat de rire perpétuel, Jean-Pierre. Il était gai comme il n'est pas possible, quoi. Il était à l'inverse des sombres polars qu'il faisait. D'ailleurs, j'ai retrouvé des photos où il était avec mon père, 2 ou 3 photos, et lui toujours en train d'éclater des rires sur les photos. Alors que mon père a un côté très sérieux, marche, le côté du bon député socialiste qui doit faire bonne figure. Mais Jean-Pierre rigole tout le temps, tout le temps, tout le temps.
I think that contrary to the seriousness of his films, Jean-Pierre was really somebody who he loved life. He loved laughing. He was laughing all the time. And he had this wonderful laugh and this wonderful way of bursting into laughter that really demonstrated the great joy that he had just in living. And it was a formidable laugh when you heard it. He was very gay and very happy with it. And, you know, in the Grimbach family, this is our family name. When we look back, no male member of the family had ever lived beyond the age of 55. And Jean-Pierre was included in that. And he lived with this. He knew that, you know, this was perhaps the family destiny. And so he always had that hanging over his head. He always had that idea that it would probably happen to him as well. And, you know, in our family, he was 55. My dad died when he was 54. And it was really, for us, it was like the family curse. We all knew that it was going to happen. But yet with Laurent and myself, we're the first two in our family. We're both 85. We have both surpassed the 55 cutoff. We've managed to make it this far. We've both also had the curse of the heart condition that goes in the family, that runs in the family. But thanks to modern medicine with stents and other medical procedures, we've been able to last this long and have the intention of going on a lot further. But I know that with Jean-Pierre, he always knew that in a way that his time was limited. And during that time, he tried to laugh and enjoy things, which is the exact opposite of what we see in these very dark polars that he made. And that's the contradiction is there. Yes.
I was hoping I could find this before we have to wrap up, but I found this old photo of Jean-Pierre Melville. Let me see if I'm holding this right, but looking very friendly with one of his cats here, which I think is so not the way we picture him. Usually the photos are with sunglasses and his Stetson hat, which was kind of his signature, looking very stern. But here we have him almost clowning around for the camera with his pet cat. To wrap up our session, can we go back? Just tell us this scene. I've never really understood it in Le Cercle Rouge. Why is there the scene with the two cats in Bourville? It doesn't seem. It seems like a personal allowance, a touch that he's in. You know, Melville wants to include into the life of this character. What is your read? What do you think of when you see this
Exactly the same. This is, he did that just a little glimpse to his private life with his own cats. Completely. I mean, it was
a moment of tenderness. You know, here's a
Completely.
very stern and severe man in the professional world, and here the camera allows us to see a different side of him. It's almost funny to realize this man has cats. It's not the same thing, but it's like him going home and putting on a pink bathrobe or something, you know.
Le chat qu'on vient de voir, Peter, c'était le dernier chat de Jean-Pierre. C'est un chat qu'il avait trouvé tout petit dans la rue et il s'appelait Griffolet. Ce chat tigré, il l'avait appelé Griffolet parce qu'il passait son temps à boire du lait et à tremper ses pattes dans la bassine du lait.
And the cat is actually, it was Jean-Pierre's cat, and it was the last cat that he had, and it was a cat he had rescued from off the street, and he was called Griffolet, and he was always trying to get him to drink milk. He was always drinking milk.
Well, I think that's probably all the time we have today, but we have one more session, and here we've kind of talked about the end of Melville's life, the end of his career, but we'll be going back to, I think this is the earliest of his films that we've looked at, maybe not, the Léon Morin comes before Bob Le Flambeur, right? But it'll give us a chance to sort of go back and look at the importance of Melville as an independent filmmaker at a moment when world cinema and French cinema were changing completely. I hope to see you all there again next month.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Peter. Merci. Au revoir tout le
Take
monde.
care. Bye-bye.
Salut, mon petit Laurent.